The words hung in the air like poison. Paul Stanley looked directly at Ace Frehley across the conference table and said what he'd apparently been thinking for months. "You need to understand something, Ace. You're replaceable. We can find another guitarist. What we can't replace is the brand. And right now, you're damaging the brand." Gene Simmons sat beside Paul, silent, arms crossed, his face unreadable. Ace stared at both of them for a long moment, then did something that would haunt Paul Stanley for the next 14 years. He stood up, pushed his chair back without a word, and walked out of the room. He didn't slam the door. He didn't argue. He didn't fight back. He just left. And in that silence, Kiss began to die. It was February 18, 1982, in a sterile conference room at Polygram Records in New York City. Outside, fans were lined up for blocks waiting for Kiss to announce their next tour. Inside, the biggest band in rock and roll was tearing itself apart over money, control, and the growing realization that the four men who'd built an empire together no longer trusted each other, no longer even liked each other, and were about to make decisions that would cost them everything they'd worked for. But the fractures had started much earlier than that February morning. They'd started in late 1980, when Peter Criss had left the band, when the original lineup that had conquered the world had fractured for the first time. Peter's departure had been messy, bitter, full of accusations about money and drugs and betrayals. But at least it had been a fight. At least there had been passion, emotion, the acknowledgement that what they were breaking apart mattered. Ace's exit would be different. Colder. More calculated. More painful because everyone involved knew exactly what they were doing and chose to do it anyway. Kiss in 1982 was not the same band that had dominated the 1970s. The makeup era was ending. Album sales were declining. The critics who'd always dismissed them as a gimmick were being proven right, or so it seemed. Music was changing. MTV had launched the year before, and suddenly image mattered in new ways. New wave and punk were making arena rock seem bloated and outdated. Kiss was still successful, still selling out shows, but the trajectory was downward, and everyone could feel it. Gene and Paul, ever the businessmen, had started thinking about the future. How to keep Kiss alive when the original magic was clearly fading. How to maintain the brand, the merchandising empire, the money machine they'd built. And increasingly, their solution involved less input from Ace, less creative control for the guitarist who'd helped define their sound, less respect for the man who'd been there from almost the beginning. Ace could feel it happening. The slow erosion of his position in the band he'd helped create. It started with small things. His songs being pushed to album B-sides. His input in production meetings being dismissed. Gene and Paul making decisions without consulting him, then presenting them as done deals. The way they'd talk over him in interviews, finish his sentences, speak for him like he wasn't there or wasn't capable of speaking for himself. The relationship between Paul and Ace had always been complicated. They weren't close friends the way some bands were. They were colleagues, collaborators, four guys who'd found each other because they shared a vision of what rock and roll could be. But as Kiss had grown, as the business side had become more important than the music, as Gene and Paul had consolidated power, Ace had found himself increasingly on the outside. Paul Stanley was the frontman, the star child, the voice of Kiss. He was charismatic, driven, ambitious. He'd overcome a birth defect, microtia, which left him deaf in one ear and deformed on one side of his face, to become one of rock's most confident performers. That struggle had hardened him, made him fierce about protecting what he'd built. But it had also made him controlling, unwilling to show weakness, quick to perceive threats even from his own bandmates. Gene Simmons was the businessman, the demon, the man who'd turned rock and roll into a merchandising empire. He was brilliant, strategic, always thinking 3 moves ahead. But Gene's brilliance was cold. He saw people as assets or liabilities, judged their value by their contribution to the bottom line. And increasingly, in Gene's calculations, Ace Frehley was becoming a liability. Ace was different. He'd never been comfortable with the business side of Kiss. He was the space ace, the cosmic guitar hero, the guy who just wanted to play. He'd grown up in the Bronx, learned guitar because it was the one thing that made sense to him, joined Kiss because he loved the music. The merchandising, the marketing, the corporate meetings about brand extension, none of that had ever interested him. He'd gone along with it because it was part of the deal, but his heart had always been in the guitar, in the music, in the performance. By 1981, the tension had become impossible to ignore. Ace's solo album in 1978 had been the most successful of the 4 solo albums Kiss had released simultaneously, which had created its own problems. Gene and Paul, who'd always seen themselves as the leaders, had been threatened by Ace's independent success. It proved he didn't need them, that the space ace persona could exist outside of Kiss. That had shifted the power dynamic in ways Gene and Paul hadn't liked. Then came the battles over the direction of the music. Gene and Paul wanted to move toward a more commercial sound, something that would work on the new MTV, something safer and more marketable. Ace wanted to keep the edge, the hard rock that had made them famous. They'd fought about it in the studio, fought about it in production meetings, fought until Ace had stopped fighting because he realized his voice didn't matter anymore. The final album Ace would record with Kiss, Creatures of the Night, became a battlefield. Ace had recorded guitar parts, only to have them replaced or heavily edited by session musicians Gene and Paul had brought in without telling him. He'd written songs that were rejected or shelved. He'd shown up to mixing sessions to find decisions had already been made, his parts already changed. By December 1981, Ace had known he was being pushed out. He just hadn't known how deliberate it was until that contract negotiation meeting in February. The meeting had been scheduled to discuss touring and recording commitments for the next 2 years. Gene and Paul's lawyers had drawn up new contracts, new terms, new profit-sharing arrangements that heavily favored Gene and Paul. Ace's lawyer had reviewed the documents and told him bluntly, "They're cutting you out. These terms are designed to make you quit." Ace had known what he was walking into when he arrived at that Polygram conference room. He'd known it would be confrontational. What he hadn't expected was the coldness, the complete lack of acknowledgement for what they'd built together, for the years of friendship and collaboration. Paul had started the meeting with business talk. Revenue projections, touring schedules, merchandising deals. Everything framed as if Ace was just another employee, not a founding member, not the guitarist whose solos had defined half their biggest hits, not the man who'd been on stage with them since 1973. "We need to talk about commitment," Paul had said, looking at Ace directly. "The band needs full commitment. No side projects, no solo work, no distractions." "I haven't done a solo project in 3 years," Ace had replied, his voice calm. "But you want to," Gene had interjected. "We know you want to. And we can't have that. Kiss needs to be the priority. The only priority." "It has been," Ace had said. "I've been at every show, every recording session, every commitment we've had." "Physically present isn't the same as committed," Paul had said, and there had been something sharp in his tone, something accusatory. "We need your full engagement. Your full buy-in to where we're taking this band." "And where is that?" Ace had asked. That's when the real conversation had started. Gene and Paul had laid out their vision. A new sound, more commercial, more polished. New musicians they wanted to bring in for recording. A de-emphasis on individual personas in favor of the Kiss brand. Everything designed to make Kiss sustainable even if members left, even if the original lineup fractured completely. "You want to make Kiss into something where we don't matter," Ace had said quietly. "Where the 4 guys on stage are interchangeable." "We're thinking long-term," Gene had replied. "We're thinking about survival. The music industry is changing. We have to change with it. By erasing what made us special in the first place." "What made us special was the marketing," Paul had said, and his voice had been hard. "What made us special was the vision Gene and I had for what Kiss could be. The makeup, the characters, the brand. That's what matters. That's what we need to protect. And the music? The actual playing? Paul had paused, and in that pause, Ace had seen everything he needed to know. The music was secondary now. Maybe it always had been to Paul and Jean, but they'd at least pretended it mattered. Now they weren't even pretending. The music is important, Paul had finally said. But it's not irreplaceable. Good guitarists are everywhere. What's irreplaceable is the Kiss brand. The image. The empire we've built. That's when Ace had understood. This wasn't a negotiation. This was a message. Get in line or get out. So what you're saying, Ace had said slowly, is that I'm not actually necessary. Anyone could play guitar. Anyone could wear the Space Ace makeup. The person inside doesn't matter. That's not what we're saying, Jean had started, but Paul had cut him off. Actually, that is what we're saying. You need to understand something, Ace. You're replaceable. We can find another guitarist. What we can't replace is the brand. And right now, you're damaging the brand. The words had been like a physical blow. Ace had sat there, staring at Paul, this man he'd spent nearly a decade working alongside, traveling with, creating with. And Paul had stared back, unflinching, meaning every word. Jean had stayed silent, but his silence was agreement. They'd discussed this before. They'd planned this. This was coordinated, calculated. They wanted him to know he didn't matter. Ace had thought about arguing. He'd thought about defending himself, listing his contributions, making them acknowledge what he'd given to Kiss. But in that moment, he'd realized something important. They already knew. They knew exactly what he'd contributed, what he meant to the band's sound, to its success. They just didn't care. Because in their calculation, protecting the brand was more important than honoring the people who'd built the brand in the first place. So Ace had stood up. He'd pushed his chair back, the sound harsh in the quiet conference room. He'd looked at Paul, then at Jean, and he'd made a decision. He wouldn't fight for people who didn't value him. He wouldn't beg to be treated with basic respect. He would leave with his dignity intact, even if it cost him everything. I'm done, Ace had said simply. Sit down, Ace, Jean had said, and for the first time, there had been uncertainty in his voice. We're not finished. Yes, we are, Ace had replied. And he'd walked out. He'd walked through the Polygram building, past the gold records on the walls, past the promotional posters of Kiss, past secretaries who nodded at him without knowing what had just happened. He'd walked out into the cold February morning and realized he was free. It felt terrible and liberating at the same time. Back in the conference room, Paul and Jean had sat in silence. They'd expected Ace to fight back, to argue, to negotiate. They hadn't expected him to simply leave. And in that moment, they'd both felt something they wouldn't admit for years: they'd made a mistake. But the mistake was already made, and neither of them was willing to back down. Instead, they'd doubled down. They'd released statements saying Ace was taking a break, that his departure was amicable, that Kiss would continue stronger than ever. They'd held auditions for a new guitarist, eventually settling on Vinnie Vincent, a talented player who could technically replace Ace's guitar parts but could never replace what Ace had brought to the band's chemistry. The tours that followed were successful by most measures. Kiss still filled arenas, still made money. But something was missing. The fans could feel it. The magic that had made Kiss special, the chemistry between four specific people who'd somehow found each other at the exact right moment, was gone. Paul and Jean had continued to build the Kiss empire. They'd licensed the name, the images, the brand to everything imaginable. Kiss became more valuable as intellectual property than it had ever been as a band. But it was hollow. They'd saved the brand by killing what had made the brand meaningful in the first place. Ace, meanwhile, had pursued his solo career. It had its successes and failures. He'd struggled with addiction, with finding his identity outside of Kiss, with the reality that being a solo artist was harder than being part of a legendary band. But he'd also found freedom. He could make the music he wanted, play the way he wanted, be Paul Frehley instead of Space Ace when he chose to be. Years passed. Kiss continued without Ace, going through multiple lineup changes, taking off the makeup in 1983, trying to reinvent themselves repeatedly. Paul and Gene would occasionally mention Ace in interviews, always carefully, always with the implication that Kiss was better without him, more professional, more reliable. But privately, both of them were beginning to realize what they'd lost. Gene, ever the businessman, started to see it in the numbers. Album sales weren't what they used to be. The tours were profitable but not spectacular. The new musicians were competent but didn't capture fan imagination the way the original four had. The Kiss brand was valuable, but it was increasingly a nostalgia brand, valued for what it had been, not for what it currently was. Paul's realization was more personal. He'd achieved everything he'd wanted: control of the band, creative authority, the frontman position without anyone to share it with. But something was missing. The joy of performance had diminished. The collaborative energy that had made Kiss exciting was gone. He'd won the power struggle, but the victory felt empty. By the mid-1990s, the music industry was experiencing a nostalgia wave. Reunions were becoming popular. Bands from the 1970s were reforming with original lineups, playing to sold-out crowds of fans who wanted to relive their youth. MTV had started pushing for a Kiss reunion unplugged performance. The money being offered was substantial. But more than that, there was a growing sense that maybe, possibly, the original lineup should have one more chance. The conversation about a reunion had started carefully. Gene and Paul had sent out feelers through mutual friends, through management, trying to gauge whether Ace and Peter would even be interested. The response had been cautious but positive. Everyone was older now. The wounds were old enough that maybe, possibly, they could heal. The first face-to-face meeting between Paul and Ace in 14 years had happened in a hotel suite in Los Angeles in late 1995. Just the two of them, no managers, no lawyers, no Gene. They needed to talk, really talk, about what had happened and whether it could be repaired. Paul had been the one to initiate. He'd called Ace directly, his voice awkward on the phone, saying they needed to talk before any reunion could happen. Ace had agreed, curious to see what Paul would say after all these years. They'd sat across from each other in that hotel suite, two men in their mid-40s who'd once changed rock and roll together and then torn it apart. The silence had been heavy with everything unsaid. Paul had spoken first. "I need to say something. Something I should have said years ago. I was wrong. What I said to you in 1982, about you being replaceable, I was completely wrong. And I'm sorry." Ace had sat quietly, letting Paul continue. "I was young and stupid and scared," Paul had continued, his voice rougher now, emotion creeping in. "I was scared of losing control, scared that if we didn't do things my way, Kiss would fall apart. So I pushed you out. I made you feel like you didn't matter. And in doing that, I proved I didn't understand what made Kiss work in the first place." "Which was?" Ace had asked. "The four of us. The specific chemistry of Paul, Gene, Peter, and Ace. That wasn't replaceable. We tried. We brought in other guitarists, other drummers. Some of them were technically better players. But none of them were you. None of them had what you brought to Kiss. And without that, Kiss was just," Paul had paused, searching for the word, "a cover band. We were covering ourselves. Playing Kiss songs, wearing Kiss costumes, but we weren't really Kiss. Because Kiss was us. The four of us." Ace had listened to all of this, his expression unreadable. Finally, he'd spoken. "You hurt me, Paul. What you said that day, about me being replaceable, that hurt more than anything that's happened in my career. Because we'd built this together. We'd been through everything together. And you threw it away like it meant nothing. I know, Paul had said quietly. And I've regretted it every day since. Have you? Ace had asked, and there had been genuine curiosity in his voice. Because you kept going. You kept Kiss alive. You built the empire you wanted. Seems like you got exactly what you were after. I got control, Paul had admitted. I got to make all the decisions, do things my way, not have to compromise. And you know what I learned? That's lonely. That's empty. I won the power struggle, but I lost the band. The real band. The band that mattered. They'd talked for hours that day. About the fights, the resentments, the ways they'd both been wrong. About what Kiss had meant, what it could mean again. About whether they could work together, really work together, as equals rather than as a frontman and his replaceable backing musician. At the end of that conversation, Ace had asked Paul one question. If we do this reunion, are we partners? Real partners? Or am I still the replaceable guy? Paul had looked him directly in the eyes and said, without you, there is no Kiss. Not real Kiss. I understand that now. You were never replaceable. I'm sorry it took me 14 years to say it. The Kiss reunion tour in 1996 to 1997 became one of the highest-grossing tours in rock history. The makeup was back. The original four were back. The chemistry that had made them legendary was back. Night after night, in sold-out arenas around the world, they proved that some magic can't be manufactured, can't be replaced, can only exist when specific people come together in specific ways. During one show on that reunion tour, in New York City at Madison Square Garden, Paul had paused between songs. It wasn't scripted. It wasn't planned. But he'd turned to Ace and said something that the front row fans heard and later reported. You were right to walk out. I was wrong. Thank you for coming back. Ace had nodded, had kept playing, but people who were there said they saw him smile behind the makeup, a real smile, the first genuine smile he'd worn on a Kiss stage in years. The reunion wouldn't last forever. By 2002, tensions would surface again, and Ace would leave again. But this time it was different. This time it was about creative differences and personal choices, not about being told he was replaceable. This time he left knowing his value, knowing what he'd contributed, knowing that Kiss without Ace Frehley was diminished whether Paul and Gene wanted to admit it or not. In later years, in interviews, Paul Stanley has been more reflective about what happened in 1982. He's acknowledged the mistakes, the arrogance, the way he let business thinking override human relationships. I told Ace he was replaceable, Paul said in a 2014 interview. That was the stupidest thing I've ever said. He wasn't replaceable. None of us were. That's what made Kiss work. We were four irreplaceable individuals who, together, created something bigger than any of us could have created alone. It took me years to understand that. I wish I'd understood it before I drove him away. Gene Simmons, characteristically, has been less openly emotional about it, but even he has admitted that replacing Ace was impossible. We had great guitarists after Ace, Gene said in a 2016 interview. Technically skilled, professional, dedicated. But they weren't Ace. They couldn't be. Ace was part of the DNA of Kiss. When he left, we lost something we couldn't get back, no matter how many talented players we hired. Ace himself has been philosophical about the entire experience. Paul said I was replaceable. That hurt at the time. But it also freed me. It made me realize I didn't need Kiss to be Ace Frehley. I didn't need their validation. I could walk away and survive. And when I came back for the reunion, it was on my terms, as an equal, not as a hired hand. So maybe Paul did me a favor. He showed me my own strength. The lesson of that February day in 1982 isn't really about Kiss. It's about something more universal. It's about how organizations can lose sight of what made them special while focusing too hard on preserving the brand. It's about how leaders can confuse control with strength, how they can believe that people are replaceable parts in a machine when in reality, the right people in the right combination create something irreplaceable. It's about the cost of those words, "You're replaceable." Words spoken by bosses, by leaders, by people in power who believe that roles matter more than the individuals filling those roles. Those words might achieve their immediate goal, establishing dominance, enforcing control, making someone feel small. But they also break something that can't easily be repaired. They damage trust, loyalty, collaboration. They turn partnerships into employment relationships, turn creativity into obligation. Paul Stanley learned that lesson the hard way. It cost him 14 years with one of the best guitarists in rock and roll. It cost Kiss its original magic for over a decade. It cost Paul the joy of working with someone who'd been there from the beginning, who understood the vision because he'd helped create it. But he also learned something else. That apologies matter. That admitting you were wrong matters. That some relationships, if they meant enough in the first place, can survive even brutal damage if both people are willing to repair them. The 1996 reunion wasn't just about nostalgia or money. It was about Paul finally saying what he should have said in 1982, "You matter. You're valued. You're irreplaceable." Today, Kiss continues to perform with various lineups. Gene and Paul are still there, still in control, still managing the brand they've spent decades building. Ace comes and goes, collaborates when it makes sense, maintains his independence. The relationship is complicated, as it always was, but it's no longer toxic. There's mutual respect now, earned through years of distance and the hard work of reconciliation. And somewhere in a vault, probably in multiple vaults, are recordings from that 1982 conference room meeting. Not actual recordings, no one was taping, but metaphorical ones, stored in the memories of three men who learned that day that some words, once spoken, can never be fully taken back. You're replaceable. Those words defined a relationship, destroyed a partnership, and ultimately taught everyone involved what truly matters, not the brand, not the control, not the empire, but the people. The specific, irreplaceable, flawed, brilliant people who, when they come together in the right way, create magic that no marketing strategy can manufacture. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been told you're replaceable, if you've ever said it to someone else and regretted it, if you've ever had to rebuild a relationship you thought was permanently broken, share this. Leave a comment about your experience. Sometimes the most important stories aren't about rock and roll. They're about respect, dignity, and the courage to admit when you were wrong. Subscribe for more untold stories about the moments that define us, the words that break us, and the reconciliations that prove some things are worth fighting for.